All right, we have reached our final chunk of the engagement stage, kind of the last part of our spiel that we give our clients when they come to their first session, and that is confidentiality. It's a super important component to the informed consent and engagement process because, as we said 1,000 million bazillion times, one of the things that's so important to the provider and client relationship is that aspect of trust and knowing that what you say will stay in the session and it's not going to be talked about, that they have the right to privacy. Well, there are times where, as a professional, we have to break confidentiality for the safety of the client or for safety of others. So going back to the Code of Ethics, it's outlined in the Ethical Standard 1.07, saying that we need to respect our clients' privacies, it's not plural, our clients' privacy, and that once private information is shared, standards of confidentiality apply. So we need to inform our clients, really highlighting the importance of confidentiality, but also highlighting there might be a few times where we would have to break it. So times that we would have to break it, I will tell you in the next slide. I'm going to tell you this one, that we need to let our clients know that this is not a choice. This is not us wanting to be gossipy or get them in trouble or spill the tea on them. It's a matter of legality. Social workers are considered mandated reporters. And so what that means is we are required to report any instances of harm, and I'll specify those a little bit on. It is something that we are required to do if it's discovered that we were privy to information and we did not disclose it to the appropriate people, and then something happened either to the client or the client did something to somebody else, we would be liable in that situation, and it does put our licensing at risk. However, on the flip side, stuff that isn't indicating that there's going to be harm or it's just the regular content in a session, we on that side don't have a choice either to not keep things private. We are obligated to keep things confidential from others. So we might get a phone call from a significant other, a parent, a teacher, a probation officer, and if there's no signed release, as much as we want to and as much as it would make sense to, we are not allowed to disclose any information without the client's permission. The only exception to that is a legal guardian, so for minors or for an adult who has an appointed guardian. They don't need a release of information. They are privy to information without that. What's important to know, and this kind of goes out of the respect for a client, that if there's a release and someone's inquiring about some information, the best policy is to only share like the bare minimum of what is clinically necessary for that party to know. So if someone was calling in and they were like, there was a release and they're like, well, we want to know, like, is so-and-so in the hospital, and this individual happened to be admitted. At that point, you are able to tell them yes, but if they might start asking all the dirty details of like, why, well, what happened? Tell me what's going on. You don't need to share everything if it's something that might be harmful for the client in that relationship. So sometimes clients don't have great relationships with the parents. Parents might actually really care, and it'd be helpful for them to know what is going on. We might just limit the information that, like all the details, and let the client have the opportunity to share that with their parent or whoever as well, if that makes sense. So yes, you want to only share the minimum and not turn it into a gossip session, because if it comes out that the client's aware that you shared things, it might hurt your therapeutic relationship. Oops. All right. So these are the times where you might have a limitation on confidentiality. And it's also, when you're sharing this with your client, you want to present it in a way that is very empowering for them, because it can feel like, oh, well, you're going to tell on me, or I can't trust you because you have to say those things. So spinning it in a way that you're sharing like, hey, like confidential is a really great thing. There are some times where we might have to, there's some limits on it. It's just for your protection. So that way, if someone's hurting you or we have concerns, it's really to make sure that you're safe and that you're receiving the best services and care possible. So again, it's kind of like not focusing on the negatives, which often get focused on with breaking confidentiality. So reminding them that there is a purpose and intent that's very, very client focused, and it's not to harm them, but actually to protect them. So the big ones that often get talked about with confidentiality is if a client discloses that they're harming themselves or they're going to harm themselves. So you kind of have to assess the lethality a little bit, because sometimes clients will disclose self-harm in the form of cutting or non-suicidal behaviors, but they're causing themselves bodily harm. And so if it's not necessarily life-threatening, you can kind of weigh that, but you would always want to consult with a supervisor. That would be a time too, if you were observing self-harm, you'd probably, with a minor, you would want to disclose or break confidentiality to their guardian or parent. If they are harming others, so if it's shared that they are abusing others or presenting with homicidal statements saying that they are intending to hurt somebody, you have to break confidentiality at that point. There is a concept called duty to warn, where you must inform the identified target. This gets really uncomfortable sometimes because, as a therapist or the provider, you're providing a safe space for your client. And so sometimes they just want to vent and like blow off some steam. And so they might say something like, yeah, I just want to blow that guy's house up. He pissed me off so much. I want to plant a bomb in his car and blow it up. And then you kind of have to use your like clinical judgment and skills to kind of figure out, like, is this blowing off steam or is this a real threat? And at the same time, if you're not quite sure and you are like, well, I don't want to like get this person in trouble with his friend because he's really not doing anything, so I don't want to tell the friend who said this, and then they actually go do it, that gets a disaster. So I get very anxious around the duty to warn, just because you're possibly creating, I don't want to say drama, but creating some potential chaos in this person's life by reacting to their statements when maybe it wasn't something you needed to react to. But then you have to weigh the professional liability, where you still have this duty to protect others from a client. So situations like that, you're always going to want to go to a supervisor. Do not make these decisions independently. They'll be able to kind of guide and help you process it, because it's not always a black and white answer. But you have to keep in mind that if a client does express some sort of intent to harm others, whether it's them just blowing off steam or actually wanting to, you need to take that next step and talk to your supervisor. If you get a report from them that someone's harming them, so if they're being abused physically, you need to call Child Protective Services or Adult Protective Services. This is a very important around the elderly and minor populations, because often they are extra vulnerable. They don't necessarily have as strong of a voice or the capabilities to know how to report or navigate. And so when they disclose a situation of abuse, it's really important to gather as much information as possible when you create the report. And again, sometimes those are really uncomfortable situations too, because you might be the first person that they have told, and now you have to go tell somebody else. And there can be real serious outcomes from that, for better or for worse. A report, if it's substantiated, it might result in the individual being taken from the home. If it's not, if it's looked into and no action is taken, it might make the individual extra vulnerable. It's really, really tricky, but you have to keep in mind the end objective is you're trying to keep somebody safe. And I always have in the back of my head, if I didn't report this and something happened, how would I feel? I would feel horrible. And so that's kind of like a good, very objective check and balance that I always do, because my emotions can get into it. And so kind of reminding yourself, like, it is your obligation, your duty as a trained professional. And if you didn't do it and something happened, how would you feel? So those are like the big three that you often hear people talk about, but a few others that are a little bit more, I don't want to say minor, but kind of a different like perspective on limiting confidentiality. So sometimes if you have to have a session videotaped or recorded for supervision purposes, obviously the content from your session is going to be viewed by your supervisor. And so just kind of letting them know that, again, your supervisor also keep things confidential, but they might help kind of help you process it. And again, letting them know that you'll always inform them prior to videotaping that that is occurring. So the same thing, like letting them know that you have case consultations with your peers and that your supervisor is there to help provide support to make sure that you're providing the best service as possible. Again, putting that positive swing on it. And just letting them know that whatever is shared is only the essential information. And that also keep in mind, if you do case consults, like some office environments will do like team consults or multidisciplinary. So if you have like a psychiatrist or a case manager, or like you're in a nursing home, you got nursing staff, they're going to hear content that the client has shared with you. So limiting the identifying information and only the essential information as much as possible. It's kind of your responsibility to the client as well. Also letting them know that sometimes insurance requests information because insurance wants to see that there's goal progression. Again, limiting the information shared and keeping it very clinical. And also if you ever get subpoenaed and have to go to court, you would obviously have to disclose information, but here is something you always want to do because lawyers can be slippery little buggers, is if you get a call from someone saying, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a lawyer for this person, you are being requested or you're being subpoenaed, you need to provide your case notes. Always, 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 always ask for legal proof that you are required to. It could just be a lawyer wanting your case notes for their own purposes of their case, and you do not have to disclose anything unless you are actually subpoenaed by the court. You are very vulnerable in court situations. I thankfully have never had to do that, but I've had some staff that I've supervised get subpoenaed in those situations, and because we were like, you need to show us proof, they never actually had to go, which was really, really good. So in summary, here is kind of that twofold checklist. So again, a ton of content that you have to talk at your client in the first session. It's all necessary and purposeful. It'll feel clunky again at the beginning, but figure out your song and dance, and it'll eventually become second nature. You'll find yourself saying like certain catchphrases over and over. Obviously the client won't know because you're telling it to a different client every time. But it is something you kind of have to get into the habit of, and eventually it'll come second nature. And I would honestly strongly suggest just having a checklist when you're first starting because it will help you stay organized. So after you have done all of this information, it goes back to the three possible outcomes that you might establish that professional relationship. They want to continue services with you. And then you're going to base your services off what was discussed in the informed consent piece. You might have to do a referral because you don't accept their insurance. Your schedule doesn't meet together. The person just doesn't like you. You might have figured out from some of the conversation that there's a dual relationship. Maybe they go to your church. Maybe there is just some real random overlap and it's weird, and you decide it'll be better if you go to somebody else. Or you might decide to discontinue services that clients don't agree to what the agency outlined, or they're just not ready to engage in services. And then finally, after you do one check-in question about how they feel about everything you've shared, you finally get to ask, so what brings you in today? I like to do those as non-directive, leave it open-ending, not assuming that I know what the client wants, because it's gonna give you a window about where they're ready and what they want to talk about. So it's really like, what does the client perceive as their problem? And then it opens up the door to start doing that data collection, which is the next step. Sometimes clients will deflect really what's going on, saying like, oh, it's my mom who's just annoying and everything, where it's really something deeper. But again, it shows you where the client is at. Here's some examples.